Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. So today's case was actually a case suggestion from one of you guys. I can't remember which video one of you suggested this on. I think it might have been Taylor Parker. I don't know though, but it was a case that was recommended to me recently and I made a note of it. I Googled it and oh my God, my jaw hit the ground because I had never heard of today's case and I couldn't believe it. Like, it blows my mind how undercovered today's case is. I just don't understand how this case has gone under the radar so much because it is so horrific. Today's case reminds me of like Shelley Notek and Anne Hamilton Byrne. And if you have watched my videos on those two women, I think you kind of know the possible things that happen in today's case. I mean, today's case is not exactly like Shelley Notek and Anne Hamilton Byrne, but it really reminds me of those two cases. And the case we are covering today is the case of Angela McAnulty. And all I'm going to say about today's case is that it is a heavy one. There are no amount of words that I can say to prepare you for today's case. And at the center of this case is the absolutely heartbreaking story of Jeanette Maples and some of the things that Angela McAnulty inflicted on her own daughter, Jeanette Maples, are despicable. So just a word of warning for today's case. It is not going to be an easy case to listen to right from the very beginning because Angela herself, even though she is the evil perpetrator in today's case, she also had a horrific childhood. And this case especially highlights the cycle of abuse that sometimes happens. So that is what we are going to be talking about today. So just prepare yourselves for this one and let's dive in. I just want to give a huge thank you to today's sponsor, and that is Love and Pies. So we are really getting into the winter right now. I don't know where all of you guys are from, but in the UK right now, it is freezing. And there is nothing that I love more than snuggling up on the sofa, lighting a candle, maybe having a hot chocolate, and Love and Pies fits in perfectly because Love and Pies has to be the coziest game I think I've ever played. Because Love and Pies, you play as single mom Amelia Green, who has recently taken over the family cafe. However, there is also this huge mystery because Amelia's mom has gone missing and Amelia is trying to figure out like what has happened to her mom. There are so many juicy secrets to uncover and it's just the perfect cozy game for all of us true crime fans out there because it's like a mystery and it is packed full of drama and the storyline truly is incredible. I am so invested in the storyline of Love and Pies. It is so well written. It's like following your own little rom-com. I love seeing the relationship between Amelia and Joe, and I'm sure you guys are as well. So there is the mystery storyline running through the game. You also get to renovate your own cafe, which I love doing anything like that, but you also get to bake along the way. I mean, hence the name of the game, Love and Pies. And that is what makes this game so cozy. You can also make hot chocolates and the hot chocolates look so good. Whenever I am making a hot chocolate for an order for a customer, it makes me crave a hot chocolate. And I love seeing all of the comments from you guys that you also play Love and Pies. It truly warms my heart knowing that I have introduced you guys to this game. And right now Love and Pies are about to launch their winter events. There is a super cute winter themed picnic pass as well as a brand new Christmas festive event. And I love the seasonal events from Love and Pies. I love seeing if there is any special decorations that I can use for my cafe. And there is just so many cozy winter vibes going on in the game right now, and we're coming up to the holiday season, which is a stressful, busy season. So Love and Pies is just the perfect game to switch off, relax, snuggle on the sofa, get a hot chocolate. It is just such a great time right now to play Love and Pies if you don't already. And if you wanted to try out Love and Pies for yourself, you can download the game for free by using the link in my description box. And downloading the game through my link really does help out this channel because it lets Love and Pies know that you came from this video. So thank you again to Love and Pies for sponsoring today's video, but thank you to every single one of you guys watching right now because truly without all of you guys I wouldn't get opportunities like this. And now let's jump into today's case. Angela McAnulty was born on the 2nd of October 1968, making her a Libra. As a Libran myself, get out. Like, no, we do not accept you. Go away. And she grew up in Sacramento, California, where she lived with her mom, Nancy, her dad, Jerry, and her many siblings because, oh my God, there are so many children in today's case. It is so confusing. Angela's family tree, possibly one of the most confusing family trees I have ever come across. So straight away, Angela was born into chaos. Her mom, Nancy, was only 18 years old when she gave birth to Angela, and she already had 2 other children by 2 other men, and she's only 18 years old. And her dad, Jerry, I'm not actually sure how old he is, but he is a despicable, disgusting human being. He is so, I don't even want to call him human. Like, no, he's an absolutely vile person. And Jerry, he was known to be a very intimidating person. He was the kind of person that you did not want to get on the bad side of. It is reported that he was a member of multiple biker gangs. He associated with some very shady people, and he was just known to just be someone that you just do not mess with. And unfortunately, because a lot of people feared him, I think that allowed him to get away with a lot of things. And Jerry has also been described as a, quote, ladies' man. He was apparently very popular with the girls, which, to be honest, I just don't believe. I personally think that a lot of people were just scared of him. But Nancy, Angela's mom, when she is pregnant with Angela, Jerry was actually having multiple affairs. And Jerry got another woman pregnant at the same time as Nancy. So he had 2 women at the same time, and they were both pregnant. And as far as I'm aware, neither one of the women knew about each other. So then Nancy gave birth to Angela, and then this other woman also gave birth at pretty much the same time. And as you probably maybe already figured out, Jerry was also a bully and an abuser. He abused Nancy so badly. Like, he treated her like absolute crap. He would beat her up nearly every single day. He would beat her black and blue whilst she is pregnant as well. Nancy would just always have bruises on her, cuts. It was very obvious to a lot of people that Nancy was being abused by Jerry, but no one stepped in. No one did anything because everyone was scared of Jerry. And when Angela was 5 years old, this is when her mom finally got the courage and the confidence to leave Jerry, and she filed for divorce. And she had suffered through at least 5-6 years of constant abuse, but she has finally gotten out of this relationship. And Nancy, she was finally getting her life back together. She had her children. She had 5 children, 3 of which were Jerry's biological children, and then the other 2 were from the previous relationships before she met Jerry. But Nancy, she's finally happy. She's finally free of that relationship, but Jerry is not happy whatsoever because he is an abuser. So he hated the fact that Nancy was moving on with her life. And Nancy had started to go on some dates and just have fun. And when Jerry found out that she was going on dates and seeing other men, he was absolutely furious. And Jerry started stalking Nancy, following her, still intimidating her, still abusing her when he could. And Jerry vowed that he would get revenge. Revenge on the fact that Nancy had moved on and she was happy without him. And tragically, one evening when Nancy had gone out on a date, she would soon be discovered dead at the side of a river. Nancy had been murdered. She had been stabbed nearly 30 times in a very vicious, frenzied attack. And everyone thought that Jerry had murdered her. I mean, it makes sense. He was an abuser. He was controlling. He had vowed to get revenge. And he was insanely jealous of the fact that Nancy was moving on and going on dates with other men. It's not a coincidence that she just so happened to be on a date with a man and then all of a sudden she is murdered. Apparently, Jerry had also confessed to one of his friends that he had murdered her as well. And Jerry's own mother was so convinced that Jerry had murdered his ex-wife that Jerry's own mother went to the police to report him for the murder. And we all know that when a murder happens, the police look to the people closest to the victim. It makes sense that it was Jerry. You would think that the police would look into Jerry. He should have been suspect number 1, but he wasn't. Even though literally everything is pointing in the direction that Jerry murdered Nancy, the police, they didn't want to hear it. She was murdered in the early 70s, which was the time of the serial killer. She was also murdered in California, which there was a lot of serial killers in the 70s, 80s in California. So the police thought that Nancy was the victim of one of these serial killers. And if you actually Google Nancy's name, and her name is Nancy Fusi, her murder was linked to the Hillside Stranglers, the Zodiac Killer, and even Ted Bundy himself. The police thought that, Ted Bundy may have murdered Nancy, not her husband, not her ex-husband. No, her ex-husband, who is an abuser and a bully. Oh no, he could not have been capable of murder. It must be Ted Bundy, or the Zodiac Killer, or maybe the Hillside Stranglers. And unbelievably, Nancy's murder still remains unsolved to this very day. And Jerry has not been convicted of her murder, so I cannot sit here and say that he is responsible. However, he is the most likely person to have murdered her. So we now need to get back to Angela, as she is the main focus of today's video. But as you can imagine, Angela, after losing her mom, she was absolutely devastated. I mean, losing a parent anyway is traumatic enough for a child, but to lose a parent from a violent murder must be so much worse. Angela and her mom were reportedly very close, and Angela had a really hard time coping with her mom's murder, her mom's death. And she'd already had such a tough start in life. But were things going to get any better for Angela? No. Because Angela and her siblings were placed in the care of the very man that most likely murdered her mom. And that was Jerry. Jerry, the possible murderer, the abuser, and the bully, was now going to look after all of the children. And this is where things just get even worse for Angela. Because now Jerry was going to start abusing his own children. So it turns out that within no time at all, after possibly murdering his ex-wife, Jerry had jumped straight into another relationship with a woman called Rebecca. Now, Rebecca was actually one of his previous mistresses. Rebecca was actually the woman that he had the baby with at the same time that Nancy gave birth to Angela. So now Jerry is in a relationship with Rebecca, who also has children of her own. And now bringing Nancy's children into this household, there are a lot of children. There are 8 children in total. 3 of the children are Rebecca's, and 2 out of the 3 children that are Rebecca's are also Jerry's. And then the 5 other children in the household were Nancy's biological children. And Jerry was the father to 3 of the 5 children that were Nancy's. So then the 2 other children were Nancy's, and then their biological fathers, I don't know who they were out of the picture. And unfortunately, the 5 children that were Nancy's were treated very differently to Rebecca's children. Rebecca's children were always favoured. They were always the ones that got treated the best in the house, which still was not good, but they were treated better. Rebecca's children got presents on their birthday and at holidays, but Nancy's children, they never got presents. They never got any kind of attention. And also, Nancy's children were forbidden from talking about their dead mother. It's almost like they all had to pretend that Nancy didn't even exist, which is just so heartbreaking, but must have also been so confusing for those children. And what is also really heartbreaking is that some of the children, Nancy's children, were so young when she was murdered that they didn't realize that Rebecca wasn't their biological mom, because no one talked about Nancy. It's like Nancy didn't exist. Sorry if that was really, really confusing, but just to make it very clear, there is Rebecca and Jerry living in the house. They are the 2 adults, and then there are 8 children in this house. And it is a very, very small home. It is only a 2-bedroom home for 10 people. So a very small living space. And Jerry is an abuser. So that would have probably felt even smaller than it was. And as you've probably guessed, Jerry started abusing Rebecca, just like he did Nancy before. He would beat up Rebecca almost on a daily basis. She would be black and blue. And he would abuse Rebecca right in front of the children children. And I think that this was an intimidation tactic. Jerry was basically saying to the children, if you step out of line, this is what is going to happen to you. And Jerry would drag Rebecca into the bathroom and he would beat her senselessly until she passed out. And he would beat her so hard that there would be blood splattered on the walls of the bathroom. He would repeatedly smash her head in door frames. He would punch her so hard he would split her lip. He would give her black eyes. There was one time where Rebecca, I don't know what she did, but she angered Jerry so much that Jerry dragged her into the garage, tied her to a table in the garage, covered her in gasoline and lit a match and was about to drop the match on Rebecca, essentially possibly murdering her, setting her on fire, which is just so crazy, which is why I am convinced that Jerry murdered Nancy. Like, he completely doused her in gasoline and wanted to set her on fire. You don't do that unless you want to murder them. So he's literally there. He's lit a match and he's about to drop the match onto Rebecca, setting her on fire, when one of the children, because all of the children are watching this, one of the children actually shouted out and said, stop. But I think that this actually did snap him out of his rage, because Jerry actually did stop and he didn't set Rebecca on fire. And there was so much more abuse. It happened on a daily basis, but hopefully that gives you an idea of what Rebecca is going through. So Rebecca is definitely receiving horrific abuse, but the children are also being abused at the hands of Jerry. And Nancy's biological children always got it the worst. But all 8 of the children are being abused by Jerry. And Angela, as she got older, she was one of the children that did suffer the most abuse. So Jerry abused his children because he blamed them for causing so much stress in his life. He blamed his children for everything. He basically just blamed them for existing. The children couldn't be like normal children. They couldn't even speak, really. They couldn't ask questions. They couldn't show personality. They couldn't have fun. They couldn't laugh. They were always at risk of angering Jerry. And if you angered Jerry, you would get beaten. And the children were always constantly on edge. They never knew if what they were doing was going to anger Jerry. But the children soon realized that it was best to just keep out of the way of Jerry. The less they were in the house, the less they spoke, the less that they existed, basically, the better they would have it. On top of all of this, Angela and her siblings also had food withheld from them, which is very significant to what happens later on in this case. They were forbidden from entering the fridges or any of the food cupboards. They were given so little food to survive on. There was one time where one of the children stole a carrot, but the child was so starving that they stole a single carrot from the fridge. And Jerry found out about this and he took the carrot off the child, and Jerry grabbed the child responsible and smashed their head on the ground, removed his belt and repeatedly started whipping him. And then he threw the carrot away. He would rather throw the carrot away than let one of his starving children eat it. Angela and her siblings were also punished for the most bizarre things. And he would use various objects to beat up his children. He used his belt a lot. He would use canes and pieces of wood. There was one time where he even used a screwdriver, and he smashed a screwdriver on one of the children's head so hard that the child passed out. And why did the child get smashed over the head with a screwdriver? They laughed at the dinner table. And for some reason, like I already mentioned, Angela seemed to be one of the children that did suffer some of the worst abuse. And why that is, we just don't know. But Angela, she was a very lonely child. She was very isolated. And Angela was kind of kept away from the other children. Because when Jerry wasn't around, the children, they did bond over what was happening to them. And some of them did form close relationships. But Angela, she always just kind of kept to herself. She was very, very, very lonely. But in general, all of the children were lonely because they were not really allowed to have friends. Jerry always taught his children to not trust other children and anyone else outside of the house. And Angela just seemed to be in her own head most of the time. She was just always filled with sadness, and just no one ever cared about Angela. And she was treated differently because she was a girl. Most of her siblings were boys, but she did have 2 other sisters sisters, but Angela was the oldest girl and she was treated differently. Whilst the other boys were allowed to sometimes play outside in the garden, like play basketball for example, Angela was kept inside. Angela would also never ever receive presents on her birthday. But not just that, later on some of Angela's siblings have speculated that maybe Jerry was also sexually abusing Angela as well. Because for some reason, Jerry always liked alone time with Angela. We don't have any evidence of this, but I wouldn't be surprised. I really wouldn't. And it is really hard to get across in this video just how horrific Angela's childhood was. And I have had to almost speed through Angela's childhood because we have so much more to get onto in this case. But just know that Angela had one of the most horrific childhoods you can think of. What Angela went through reminds me of some of the things that Anne Hamilton Byrne was doing to the children in the cult, or Shelley Notek and what she was doing. But Jerry ruled their house with an iron fist. He is a disgusting, evil person. He abused every single person in his life and he should never have been allowed to have children. And unfortunately, because of the terrible childhood that Angela had, this would now go on to shape who she would become in her adult life. She never broke that cycle of abuse and she would now become possibly even worse than Jerry. So now we get to Angela aged 16. And as soon as Angela turned 16, she decided to drop out of school and move out of the family home. And after running away from home, Angela got into a relationship with a carnival worker and Angela followed him around the country and Angela just kind of drops off the radar. We don't really know anything about her life at this point. She is living a more transient lifestyle, but all we do know is that from her time traveling with this carnival, she got introduced to some very hard drugs and she became addicted. And then a few years later, when Angela turns 20, she moves back to her hometown, which is Sacramento. And this is where she meets a man called Anthony Maples. And they quickly started a relationship, they fell in love, and they bonded over their shared love of drugs. So as you can imagine, it was not a very healthy relationship. They just prioritized drugs. That is all they did. They were unemployed and they just took very, very hard drugs all day. They were constantly high. And within no time, they also decided to have 3 children. A son called Anthony Jr., another son called Brandon, and then in 1996, when Angela is 26 years old, she gave birth to a little girl called Jeanette. And tragically, Jeanette is the main subject of today's horrific case. So a year after giving birth to Jeanette, this is when Angela's life completely falls into turmoil. I mean, to be honest, it already has been, but now everything gets out of hand. Her drug use just keeps going up and up. And that is all her and Anthony are prioritizing: drugs. At this point, the 3 children are ages 6, 5, and 1, and they are being completely neglected. No one is feeding the children properly, no one is washing the children properly, just taking care of them in general. And this went on for months. And to be honest, I'm surprised that the children even survived. And eventually, after a couple of months of this happening, Angela and Anthony got arrested on drug charges. So because they both landed themselves in prison, this is when authorities became aware of the situation with the children. And unfortunately, the situation for the children would not get much better, because instead of the children being placed in foster care, the authorities looked for family members to take on the children, which of course they normally do. But unfortunately, the family member that decided to look after Angela's 3 children was Jerry, the abusive, possible murderer Jerry. And you're probably wondering, well, why the hell does Jerry want these children in the first place? I mean, he hates children. Well, he only wanted them for the extra welfare money that he was going to get. Now, thankfully, as far as I'm aware, Jerry did not abuse the 3 children. At least there is no evidence that he did, but given what we know about Jerry and the kind of person that he is, I don't think I believe this. I mean, the children must have suffered in some kind of way being in his care. However, nothing has been documented, so I can't say for sure. But things were not going Jerry's way. Angela had been released from prison. I think she spent a year in prison on drug charges, and she was trying to get custody back of her children. And Jerry didn't like that Angela was getting involved with her own children, because obviously Jerry just wanted the children for money, so he just didn't want to deal with it anymore. So he placed the children in foster care, which, to be honest, was the best place for these children. In foster care, they would finally be getting the care that they would need. So Angela is out of prison and she is still trying to get custody back of her children, but the courts won't give her custody. They don't think that she's ready to take on her children again, but she is given visitation rights. So over the next 4 years, whilst Jeanette grew up from the ages of 2 to 6, Jeanette would see her mom once a week under supervision. However, what is very predictable, Angela wasn't the most reliable mom, and some weeks she wouldn't even turn up. And then in 2001, Angela is currently aged 32. She applies for custody again of her 3 children, and the courts granted her custody of her 3 children. However, what is really shocking is that before the children were handed back to Angela, the court actually asked all 3 children whether they wanted to go back to their mom. Now, the 2 older children, the 2 boys, said no. The 2 older children could remember what it was like to live with Angela before. They could remember that she just completely neglected them and they preferred foster care. So the 2 older children said no, we want to stay in foster care. And the court granted their wishes. They stayed in foster care. And I think that that is a pretty damning statement that Angela's 2 older children are choosing to stay in foster care. But when the court then asked Jeanette what she wanted to do, Jeanette said she wanted to go back to her mom. When Angela first went into prison, Jeanette was only 1 year old, so she couldn't remember what it was like to live with Angela before. So the court granted Jeanette her wish, and the court placed Jeanette back in Angela's custody, which I just think is truly shocking. Why did this judge put this decision on a 6-year-old? That is such a big decision, and that 6-year-old can't possibly comprehend the ramifications of that decision. And it is also pretty telling that the 2 older children that could remember what their mother was like have chosen to stay in foster care. Surely that is a red flag. Surely the court should have thought, why have the 2 older children chosen to stay in foster care? I wonder why that is. Maybe we should look into this before placing this vulnerable 6-year-old back into the care of her mother. But there was no further investigation. Jeanette was just placed back in Angela's care, no questions asked. And unfortunately, this decision, placing Jeanette back in the care of her mother, would have devastating consequences. So we now get to 2002. This is approximately a year after Jeanette has been placed back in the custody of her mom. So she is now 7 years old. Angela decided to go on and have another child with an unknown man, meaning that there is now another child in this home, and Jeanette now has a younger sister called Patience. And Jeanette was over the moon about having a little sister. And then not long after that, Angela entered into a relationship with a man called Richard McAnulty, who will go on to be a very significant person in today's case. Angela and Richard got married. They went on to have a child themselves. It's like, seriously, why do these people just keep having children? So they went on to have a child themselves, who they called Richard Jr. So now they are living as a family of 5. We have Angela and Richard, and then the 3 children, Jeanette, Patience, and Richard Jr. And for a while, things are okay for the family. I can't exactly say that they're great, but they're okay. However, a few years later, in 2005, the family decide to move from Sacramento to Eugene, Oregon. And this is where things now start to go terribly wrong. So Angela is now in her early 30s. Jeanette is currently 10 years old. And for some reason, we don't actually know the reason, but for some reason, this move to Eugene, Oregon, Angela started to have a massive problem with her oldest daughter, Jeanette. For some reason, Angela just started to single out Jeanette, and not in a good way. And if you cast your minds back to Angela's own childhood, Angela was singled out. And now this is what Angela is doing to Jeanette. And I can't help but notice the similarities between Angela and how she was treated as a child to now how Angela is going to treat Jeanette. Angela is essentially projecting her own childhood onto Jeanette. Angela decides to turn into her father, and she turns into somebody worse than her father, which I cannot believe. Like, how do you get much worse than Jerry? And this is now where the horrific campaign of abuse towards Jeanette starts. And initially, it started off small, as most abuse does, because Angela wanted complete control over Jeanette. She wanted to slowly manipulate Jeanette into following her every command. So Angela started punishing Jeanette for even the smallest infractions, just like her own father had done to her. And initially, the punishments were small. Angela would send Jeanette to her room, but then Angela escalated it. Jeanette would then be sent to her room for hours and not be let out. But then it escalated because then Angela put a lock on her bedroom door, locking her daughter Jeanette in her room for hours and not letting her out. But then it escalated again, and Angela wanted to start to control when Jeanette used the bathroom. And Jeanette was often left in a state where she was absolutely desperate to use the toilet. And Angela even resorted to placing a lock on every bathroom, not allowing her daughter access to the bathroom, access to a toilet. Jeanette was only allowed to use the bathroom with her mother's permission, which she rarely granted. Angela was also treating Jeanette completely differently to her other two children. Jeanette's siblings, on birthdays and Christmas, they would get presents, they would get attention and care. Well, Jeanette never got any of that. Angela really is trying to project her own childhood on Jeanette. And I don't know what happened. It's almost like Angela was so angry and so hurt by what has happened in her own childhood that she wants to hurt somebody else. And she wants to hurt somebody else that reminds her of herself. And actually, now that I sit here and think about it, I said, I don't know, about 5-10 minutes ago, I don't know how long ago, I said, what changed? What changed in the move from Sacramento to Eugene? Why all of a sudden is Angela now abusing her daughter? And I wonder if it's because Jeanette is now at a similar age to Angela when Angela started to be abused as a child. I wonder if it has triggered off a lot of thoughts and memories from her own childhood. I don't know, I'm just thinking here. Angela would also forbid the other two children from interacting with Jeanette, leaving Jeanette completely isolated in that home with no one to turn to, no one to talk to. And the other two siblings in the house, Patience and Richard Jr., they witnessed a lot of the abuse towards Jeanette. And then once Angela had Jeanette living in complete fear and isolation of being constantly locked in her room for hours on end, never being let out, not allowed to go to the bathroom, this is when Angela began to implement her next form of control over her daughter, and that was food. I know I sound like a broken record, but again, this really mirrors Angela's childhood because Jerry also restricted food from his own children. Angela as a child was forbidden from going into the fridge, going into food cupboards. She had to live off tiny bits of food and scraps. Well, now she's doing the exact same thing to Jeanette. Angela gave Jeanette hardly any food. Like, I'm talking barely enough, like just enough to survive. Jeanette was not allowed in the kitchen cupboards. She was not allowed in the fridge. They would all be sat at the dinner table and they would all have big, large plates full of food, but Jeanette was not allowed any. And the whole family would just be sat there eating their dinner in front of Jeanette, who was there starving. And that is just a form of torture. And if Jeanette ever complained that she was hungry, she was forced to eat raw, hot chili peppers. Locks were placed on the kitchen cupboards and on the fridge to prevent Jeanette ever going in them to get food. And if you think that that is extreme, well, Angela also decided to start controlling how much water Jeanette would drink. Jeanette became so dehydrated because she was barely given any water. Angela went to the extreme measures of turning off the water supply and removing the taps and the faucets so Jeanette couldn't have any access to water. So when Angela wasn't around, Jeanette was forced to drink water out of the dog bowl or the toilet bowl. That is just unbelievable. You don't even want to think about a child, a 10-year-old child, drinking out of a toilet because they are so dehydrated. How in the world could anyone do that to a child? It breaks my heart thinking about Jeanette as this poor, innocent, vulnerable 10-year-old and what her mother is doing to her. So this abuse goes on for well over a year. And eventually Jeanette begins middle school. And at this point, teachers and her classmates had started to notice that something was going on with Jeanette. People had started to notice that she was extremely underweight and underdeveloped for her age. People had also noticed that she seemed to constantly be hungry and that she seemed to just never have any food on her. Her parents never gave her any lunch to take to school or money to buy food at school. Jeanette also wore the same clothes every day, which were really dirty, tattered sweatpants and then a very baggy, yellowing t-shirt. And she didn't really bathe at home either, so she did smell. And most of the kids in her class felt sorry for her. A lot of the children seemed to have emotional maturity and realized that she had it hard at home. So a lot of her classmates were really nice to Jeanette. They would share their lunch with her. They would bring in extra snacks from home, which honestly warms my heart. It really does. Like sometimes kids can be mean, they can, but also sometimes kids can be so aware and observant of what is going on. And sometimes kids can just truly be the sweetest. But of course, some of the kids were mean to Jeanette as well, because you always do get the bullies, but thankfully most of the kids in the school were really nice and supportive of Jeanette and just tried to help her out as much as they could. There was also a lunch lady called Michelle Mullins who almost took Jeanette under her wing, and she started to give Jeanette free school meals. So Jeanette finally had a full plate of food that was hot, that was healthy, so at least she was getting one decent meal a day. And one day Michelle, the lunch lady, asked Jeanette to show her what her parents had given her for lunch. So Jeanette opened up her bag, and inside her lunch bag was one piece of cheese and a cracker. That was it. But then one day Jeanette came into school crying because her mom had found out that she was having free school meals, that she was having food at school. And Angela had apparently noticed that Jeanette was putting on too much weight. Oh my god, this woman, like seriously, I hate her so much. So Jeanette was not allowed to eat anymore, and Jeanette was so scared of her mom that the free school meals, they disappeared. But despite all of the abuse and neglect that Jeanette was experiencing at home, she tried so hard at school. She put in so much effort at school because she loved school. And do you know why she loved school? It was because it was her safe haven. At school, she was safe. She may be hungry, but she was safe. She was away from her mom. She could go to the toilet whenever she wanted. She wasn't going to be abused. She had people that would talk to her. So Jeanette threw herself into school. She joined every single activity group or sports group. She just joined as much things as she possibly could so she could spend as much time at school as she could and away from home. Jeanette would also spend so much time in the library, and she loved reading so much. She loved reading and poetry, and she would go to the library after school and just sit there and read. And she would stay in the library until the librarian had to literally kick her out because they were closing. And it's just so sad to think about Jeanette doing everything that she possibly can to not return home. However, every single day when she returned home from school, she was beaten, she was abused, she was neglected, she was locked in her room, food was withheld from her, the toilet was withheld from her, water water was withheld from her. And this is what Jeanette's life was like every single day. And eventually things got so bad that Jeanette started to turn up to school with bruises all over her. It was obvious to everyone that Jeanette was being abused and neglected at home, and this is when action was finally taken. One day, one of Jeanette's friends, a girl called Amber, saw that her friend was covered in bruises, and Amber said to Jeanette, "What happened? Like, why do you have bruises all over you?" And this was when Jeanette, for the first time, admitted that her mom was abusing her. Now, immediately her friend Amber went home and told her parents about what was happening to her friend Jeanette. So then Amber's parents got into contact with the school and told the school what was going on, and then the school contacted CPS. So then CPS came out to the school to talk to Jeanette and said to Jeanette, could she write down all of the abuse and everything that was happening at home? And Jeanette wrote all of the abuse down. She wrote literally everything down. The fact that she was locked in her room for hours, food was withheld, water, toilet, that she was beaten, forced to eat chili peppers when she complained about being hungry, and the kind of abuse that Jeanette is going through. Oh my God, ding, ding, ding. Take that child away from the parents. Take them away from the people abusing them. But oh my God. This next bit, oh my God, makes me so angry. So CPS, after seeing all of the details of the abuse that Jeanette is going through, they go out to the house. They go and visit Angela, and unbelievably, Angela just said that her daughter was a big attention seeker, that she was a liar, and it was all made up. It was just a big story. And the CPS worker took a look around the house, saw that the kitchen was fully stocked with food, saw that the other two children living in the house were happy and healthy, and came to the conclusion that Angela must be right. Jeanette is an attention seeker. She's lying. I mean, there's food in the kitchen. Jeanette can clearly just go in there and get something to eat. So the case was closed. The CPS worker decided that Jeanette, the child, was a compulsive liar. Even though the child has bruises all over them, is visibly malnourished. I assume that Angela took all the locks off of the kitchen cupboards and the fridge, because you would think, you would hope, that if a CPS worker saw that there was locks on all of the cupboards, that would be very telling. So I assume that Angela took all the locks off. But seriously, you only needed to take one look at Jeanette to realize that something is going on. But Angela, she was furious that CPS had gotten involved. So what does she do? She was fed up with other people meddling with her children and how she treated them. So she pulled Jeanette out of school. I'm sorry, you shouldn't be allowed to do that. No. You can't just pull a child out of school, especially if it is suspected that that child is being abused. I am sorry, but is that not the biggest red flag here? So Jeanette is now homeschooled from now on. Jeanette has now lost that safe haven of school, and the authorities in this case failed Jeanette so badly. And because no one really seemed to bother about Jeanette, no one checked on her, there was no further investigation, because Jeanette was now hidden in the home of her abuser, this will lead to a tragic set of consequences. Because now that Jeanette was home 24/7, not being exposed to the outside world and anyone that could have alerted the authorities to what was going on, the abuse just got even worse. The beatings that Jeanette was now receiving was so much more violent and vicious. Angela would slap Jeanette across the face over and over again. She would also punch and kick Jeanette all over her body. But on top of these regular beatings, Angela would also impose some of the most inhumane torture imaginable on her daughter. She would force Jeanette to stand in the corner of the room on one foot, with her arms held straight up in the air, and she would have to stand like this, sometimes also holding a heavy object, for hours. She would sometimes also make Jeanette kneel in the corner, and Jeanette would be in excruciating pain, stood there on one foot trying to balance with her arms in the air, and even if she put just a toe on the floor, she would get a beating. And the beatings were also getting worse. In the beginning, Angela would beat up Jeanette in front of the other two children, but now the beatings were so severe that she would only beat up Jeanette in her own bedroom, away from the other two children, because because it was that bad and that violent. Angela had a little routine when she was going to abuse her daughter. She would put the TV on really loud, or she would put the vacuum cleaner on outside of the room that she was abusing Jeanette in, so the other two children couldn't hear the abuse. And then Angela would enter Jeanette's room and essentially just torture her daughter. She would whip her with various objects like a belt, just like her dad had done to her. She also whipped Jeanette with metal rods, tree branches, and canes. Angela would also force Jeanette to remove all of her clothes because Angela wanted to strike her bare skin, causing as much pain as she possibly could. And she would cause huge lacerations all over her body that would bleed profusely. Blood would splatter all over the walls. There was blood everywhere in Jeanette's bedroom. Angela would also use other tools to torture her daughter. She would get a pair of pliers and just start picking at her daughter's skin until she would bleed. There was also a time where Angela took the pair of pliers and started pulling out Jeanette's teeth. And I'm just like, why? Why is she doing this? This is what I meant when I said she possibly becomes worse than her dad. And this went on for months, if not years, this kind of treatment of Jeanette. And the two younger siblings, they are at an age now where they're aware of what is going on. They are aged 8 and 10. And heartbreakingly, the two younger siblings would try and help Jeanette whenever they could. They would try and sneak her a glass of water where they could, or food, or just any kind of medicine. But whenever Angela would find out, she would fly off the handle at her two younger children and would threaten them with abuse as well. And Angela would also just beat Jeanette even harder. So in the end, the two younger children, they stopped helping Jeanette. There was nothing that they could do. And what is just even more disgusting is that eventually Angela made her two younger children join in on the abuse. She would order the two younger children to go out into the backyard and collect dog poop and bring it back into the house so Angela could smear the dog feces all over Jeanette's face. And Jeanette would be heaving and crying as dog poop is smeared all over her face. And the younger children would be forced to watch. It's honestly despicable. Like, why would you do this to anybody? And then there is one other person that we haven't really mentioned, and that is Angela's husband, Richard. It is very easy to forget that there is another adult in this house. Richard is in the house as the abuse to Jeanette is happening. And is Richard trying to do anything about the abuse? Oh no. Now, as far as we're aware, Richard didn't participate in the abuse himself. There may have been the odd beating here and there, which is bad enough in itself. But Richard, he just turned a blind eye. He knew exactly what was happening and he chose to ignore it. He knew what was happening when Angela would put the TV on really loud, or if she put the vacuum on outside of Jeanette's room. He knew exactly what was happening. He saw the aftermath. He saw what Jeanette looked like. He saw the blood on the walls. Apparently, Richard never did anything because he was also scared of Angela, which I 100% believe. I do believe that Angela is a very scary person, so I do believe that Richard was scared of her. However, that's no excuse. He never did anything to help Jeanette. The two younger children did more than he did. Richard never tried to sneak Jeanette food or water or medicine. He never tried to talk Angela out of the abuse. He may have been scared of Angela, but there was no threat to his life. He wasn't the one being abused. And he is an adult in this situation, and Jeanette was an innocent child. So in my eyes, Richard is just as guilty because he just sat on the sofa whilst the abuse was happening without a care in the world, and he just carried on watching TV. And apart from Richard, there was one other adult that would come over to the house occasionally and visit Jeanette, and that was Richard's mom, a woman called Lynn. Now at first, Lynn didn't realize what was happening to Jeanette because obviously the abuse in the beginning, it started off small. However, she started to notice that Jeanette was getting skinnier and skinnier, and she also had these bruises over her body. So she confronted Angela and Richard about the bruises, about how she was losing weight. And in response to this, Angela just banned Lynn from the house. Lynn was asking too many questions, so Lynn was banned from the house. So this sent off alarm bells in Lynn's mind, and she went straight to CPS to report this. But what did CPS do? Absolutely nothing. They paid a brief visit to Jeanette's home, but Angela came up with a load of BS and said that Jeanette was not actually in the house and that they wouldn't be able to speak to her. So all CPS did was speak to Jeanette's younger sister, Patience. Now, Patience was very well programmed by her mom to never speak about the abuse of Jeanette. So Patience, being a child following her mom's instructions, said that everything was okay. And the CPS worker asked barely any questions, and they were satisfied with Patience's answers. So they left and they closed the case. And it's like, oh my God, are you being serious? This is so many failures now. Lynn has reported Angela to CPS about the treatment of Jeanette. Therefore, shouldn't the CPS worker speak to Jeanette, see Jeanette with their own eyes? It is baffling. We now get to the year 2009. Jeanette is currently 15 years old. She has been out of school for approximately 2 years at this point, and we are now approaching the absolute worst thing happening. Because at this point, the violence was just getting worse and worse each day. And Jeanette had been going through this every single day for the past 2 years, but longer than that, because she was still being abused when she went to school. It is just the extreme abuse that she has been suffering for the last 2 years, and it had gone to a point where her body was just giving up. At this point, Jeanette only weighed 50 pounds. And to put that into perspective, the average 15-year-old weighs approximately 130 pounds. And Jeanette is under half of that. And then to put it even more into perspective, the average 6-year-old child weighs about 60 pounds. So Jeanette, as a 15-year-old, weighs the same as a 6-year-old. On top of this, the prolonged starvation left Jeanette with no body fat. She barely had any muscle tissue, and her body was struggling to heal itself. Jeanette at this point was too weak to move. She couldn't walk, and she was just left in her room and lay on the floor all day, every day. And she would just lie on the floor and wait for her mom to enter her room to torture her. And at this point, Angela had removed all of the furniture from Jeanette's room. So it was literally just a room. Jeanette would be left in this empty, dark room all day with nothing but a piece of cardboard on the floor for her to lie on. And the only reason why Angela allowed Jeanette to lie on a piece of cardboard instead of just the plain floor was because Angela didn't want Jeanette's blood to sink through onto the carpet. Yeah, so Jeanette had to lie on a piece of cardboard so her blood went on the cardboard instead of the carpet. Have you ever heard of something so sick in your life? And of course, Jeanette was never taken to the hospital. So instead, whenever Angela would cause these deep lacerations all over her body, she would just pour a load of antiseptic solution all over Jeanette's body, which of course would burn like hell. And that was it. No medication, no stitches, no hospitals. And over time, due to the cuts all over her body, Jeanette had developed a lot of scar tissue. Jeanette had so much scar tissue on the inside of her mouth because her lip had been split open so many times. And at one point, her lip was pulverized by Angela so badly that it actually healed inside out, leaving Jeanette's mouth completely deformed. I can't even picture that. How does somebody's lip heal inside out? Like how? And how would Angela deal with all of the scar tissue all over Jeanette's body? And I truly mean the scar tissue was everywhere. Well, she would just cut it all off with a knife. Yeah, you heard that right. Angela would cut off Jeanette's scar tissue with a knife. And of course, this would leave huge wounds, open wounds all over Jeanette's body, which would become infected, which resulted in Jeanette getting incredibly sick, and she never had any medicine, and And I'm sat here right now and I cannot believe that these words are leaving my mouth. What is wrong with this woman? Like, truly, I hate this woman so much. And Jeanette just had to put up with this week after week, month after month, year after year. She was in that room alone, starved, dehydrated, beaten, bruised, and sick. And then eventually we would get to the day where Jeanette's body could no longer fight, because in December of 2009, Angela would launch her most vicious attack yet. It started with Angela telling Jeanette to remove all of her clothes before she started repeatedly whipping Jeanette on her hip. And she was causing so many cuts to Jeanette's hip that her bone started to become exposed. Let that sink in. Angela is whipping her daughter so hard that her hip bones were exposed. And at this point, Richard entered the room. Richard entered the room. Jeanette saw him and she cried out for help. Richard took one look at the situation and walked away, turned a blind eye like he always did. Following this, Angela beat Jeanette some more, and then she picked up a tree branch, and she would sometimes use tree branches as weapons. And then she just started to mindlessly stab Jeanette in the back of the head with this tree branch over and over again, stabbing Jeanette in the back of the head with a tree branch. I'm just like, oh my God. There was no purpose for her doing this other than to inflict the most amount of pain. And it is just so sadistic, and she just kept stabbing Jeanette in the back of the head over and over again until a large hole opened up in the back of Jeanette's head. But did Angela stop? No, of course she didn't. As soon as that hole opened up, Angela kept repeatedly stabbing her in that hole in the back of her head with the tree branch. As she kept stabbing and stabbing until she reached Jeanette's brain. I'm truly speechless. She inflicted so much harm on Jeanette in this attack that Jeanette suffered brain damage. Her body started seizing up, she started foaming at the mouth, and for the next 4 whole days, yes, 4 days, Jeanette was left to lie in her room on her own on that piece of cardboard with a gaping hole in the back of her head. Jeanette could no longer stand up straight. She couldn't talk properly. She was speaking incoherently. You couldn't really make out what she was saying. She was incredibly confused. And at one point, her younger sister Patience walked into the room, and Patience has said it was like her sister was a different person. And Jeanette was left in this absolutely horrific, brain-damaged state for 4 days until the absolute worst happened. Because in the early hours of December 9th, 2009, Angela went in to check on Jeanette, and she was cold to the touch. She was still foaming at the mouth, and Angela said to Richard, quote, "I think I may have gone too far with the tree branch." But did Angela or Richard do anything at this point? Sadly, no. They just left Jeanette there to die. And that is exactly what happened. Because the next morning, when Angela and Richard went in to check on Jeanette, Jeanette was completely unresponsive. Her body had just given up. She had gone through so many years of pure torture at the hands of her own mother, a person that should have protected her, loved her, and cared for her. And what happened in the aftermath of the murder? Well, of course, Angela and Richard tried to cover it up. They didn't quite know what to do with her body, so they ended up just taking Jeanette's body and placing her in the bathtub until they decided. And then they enlisted the 2 younger siblings to clean up Jeanette's bedroom because there was blood everywhere. And then following this, Angela went out to McDonald's and treated herself. But was Angela about to get away with this? Thankfully, no. Because whilst she was in McDonald's, Richard cracked. He could no longer take the guilt of what had just happened. And I'm sorry, this makes me so angry. Because it's like, why could you have not cracked earlier? Why couldn't you have done something earlier? Because then Jeanette might still be here. But no, he cracks now after she has been murdered. So Richard cracks and he calls his mom and confesses to everything that has happened. And Richard's mom, Lynn, tells him that he better call 911 right now, otherwise she will, and she'll turn up with police to arrest them both. And you know what? Good for Lynn. And this is exactly what happened. On the evening of the 9th of December 2009, Richard had phoned 911 and confessed to everything that had happened. Shortly after, paramedics and police arrived at the scene, and this is when they found the body of Jeanette Maples in the bathtub, and she was sadly pronounced dead. Following this, Angela and Richard were both arrested. The two younger children were placed in foster care, and this is when the investigation into the horrific murder of Jeanette began. And the police searched the crime scene, and they were absolutely appalled by what they found. They found blood in pretty much every inch of Jeanette's bedroom. They pulled up the carpet and they found that blood had been pooling on the floorboards for years. They also found all of Angela's weapons in the room, like the belts and the tree branches and the metal rods and the canes. And these weapons still had Jeanette's blood and flesh on them. And when Jeanette's body was taken in for an autopsy to try and determine her cause of death, they couldn't. Doctors were absolutely shocked by how many causes of death there were. And it's just truly shocking how many things could have killed Jeanette. So first of all, she was starved and she was malnourished, and she weighed the same as a 6-year-old child. She had no body fat, practically no muscle tissue, so this could have killed her. She had a ton of infected wounds all over her body, and sepsis could have killed her. She had hundreds of injuries, broken bones, cuts so deep that her bones were exposed, and a hole in the back of her head that caused bleeding on the brain. All of this could have killed her. It was also found that she had pneumonia from an abscessed lung that sent bacteria into her bloodstream. This as well could have killed her. So we don't know. What did kill her? Did it all kill her? So the autopsy concluded that the cause of Jeanette's death was the result of prolonged, intentional torture and maiming. So Angela and Richard are taken in for questioning, and unbelievably, Richard tries to take the blame for everything. Richard says that it was all him, that Angela never did anything. And this was apparently Richard and Angela's plan if they ever got caught, because Richard had an existing heart condition and he was on medication for this condition. So the judge, seeing that he has a heart condition, might go easy on him and either give him a lesser sentence or not send him to prison at all. It's like, what does a heart condition have to do with abusing and torturing a child? But after a few hours of interrogation, Richard cracked and he told the detectives the truth about all of the years of abuse and torture that Angela had put Jeanette through, and the fact that he witnessed it all and didn't do anything. Now, when Angela was being interrogated, she tried to say that it was all an accident, that all she had ever done to her daughter was light spanking, and the rest of Jeanette's injuries simply came from a fall. But the police were having none of it, because you do not get the injuries that Jeanette had from a fall. So eventually, after being put under pressure, Angela also confessed to the truth, and both Angela and Richard were charged with murder. Now, whilst they were both being held in custody awaiting trial, an investigation into how the CPS let this happen was launched, and it was found that there were so many failings. There was a report released which stated that DHS workers had repeatedly failed Jeanette. It was found that there were multiple reports of neglect that were just ignored, and these reports were dating back years, all the way to when Jeanette was still in middle school. Angela had also been flagged as a high-risk parent, but still no investigation was carried out. And finally, it was found that Richard's mom, Lynn, had reported the abuse of Jeanette multiple times in the days leading up to Jeanette's murder. But again, the these reports were ignored. How did Jeanette slip through the cracks so many times? CPS were made aware of the situation at that home multiple times for years. So then we get to February of 2011, and this is when the trial was supposed to begin. However, given the overwhelming evidence, both Richard and Angela pleaded guilty to murder, and Richard was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. However, when it came to Angela, she obviously played a much bigger role than Richard, and the DA on the case wanted to go after the death penalty. So a sentencing hearing with a jury was held, and during this hearing, a lot of tragic testimony was given. Richard was also a key witness in this hearing, and he gave his testimony on everything that he witnessed. But another person that gave evidence at this hearing was Jeanette's younger sister, Patience. At this point, she was still only 13 years old, and she was so brave to give her account of what happened, and she went into excruciating detail on everything that she witnessed and heard. And the jury, hearing all of this evidence of what Jeanette went through, most of the jury just broke down in tears. And unbelievably, Angela just sat there through the whole trial with the biggest smirk on her face. And after all of the horrific details of what Angela did to Jeanette, the jury decided to give Angela McAnulty the death penalty. And Angela became only the second woman in the history of the state of Oregon to be given the death penalty. However, her death penalty sentence was overturned because it was found that she had inadequate counsel. So her new sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole, which means that she will never, ever get out of prison, and she still remains locked up today. And in the aftermath of this case, the community of Eugene were left so shocked and horrified by what had happened to Jeanette. Faith in CPS was completely destroyed. And this next bit, oh my God, really rubs me up the wrong way as well. So do you remember Jeanette's biological dad, Anthony? He was only a brief part of this case. Remember, he went to prison with Angela on drug charges. Well, after he had gotten out of prison, he didn't care about his daughter, never tried to make contact. Even when it was Jeanette's funeral, he still didn't turn up. But then once he realized that he might be able to make some money, a wrongful death lawyer filed a lawsuit, and Anthony won $1.5 million. And so many people around him begged him to give that money to charity, to help other children that could possibly be in a situation like Jeanette, to donate it in her name. But no, he kept every single penny for himself, and he ran off into the sunset with $1.5 million. And that just makes me so angry as well, because there was literally no one in Jeanette's life that cared about her. Why did Angela do all of this? I think it's very clear that she was just projecting her childhood onto Jeanette. So many things mirror what she did to Jeanette and what happened to her as a child. We can all agree that Angela had a terrible childhood, and no one should experience what Angela went through as a child. But it is no excuse. Angela had a lot of siblings that also went through absolutely horrific abuse. And Angela's siblings, they have had ups and downs. They have had their struggles. However, they have all gone on to live happy, fulfilled lives and started families of their own. And not one of them has turned into an abuser. They used their trauma to make sure that they were a better parent than what they had. Angela is just an evil and sadistic person to her core. And I think CPS are also to blame for today's case. And I want to end this video focusing on the poor, innocent, sweet victim of today's case, Jeanette Maples. Jeanette Maples was described as a sweet, kind, and caring girl. She loved her safe haven of school. She loved being with friends. She was also a keen writer and loved reading and poetry. And during her memorial, a piece of her poetry was read out, which said, quote, "The final place I would use my wings to go is to go really high and even higher to heaven. I would visit the angels, and I would visit my grandma Nancy and everyone else in the family. And after, I would go to Hawaii and France and Portugal and the beautiful heaven. I would use my wings to fly home." But sadly, Jeanette would never get to spread her wings. She would have to endure the most inhumane childhood imaginable. And she had so much more to give in life. And she was taken far, far too soon. She was only 15 years old. And truly, her poetry, it broke me. Just the fact that she was talking about spreading her wings and going to heaven and seeing her grandma Nancy, who, if you remember, was murdered at the beginning of this case. Even though she was suffering so much at home, you can tell by her poetry, by what her teachers and her friends have said, that she was such a pure, sweet, innocent girl with such a kind heart. And she would have given so much to this world. And that brings us to the end of today's absolutely heartbreaking case. I am really sorry to bring you such a heavy case today, but I cannot believe how undercovered this case is, and I thought it was an important case to be heard. So that brings us to the end of today's video. As always, let me know your thoughts, theories and opinions, and don't forget to leave me your case suggestions because I always want to know what you want to hear next. Thank you again to Love and Pies for sponsoring today's video, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.